When most people go to the hardware store to get a nut or a bolt, it's usually because they've got one and they need the other. And let's say they walk in there with the bolt. They're going to go to the fastener aisle and start picking up various nuts that look like they might be the right size. And they'll try it and it may or may not fit. Grab another one, grab another one. Eventually they find one that threads on just fine. You pay your 20 cents and you go home and you're done. And for me, I got tired of making a trip to the hardware store every single time that I needed a fastener. So I went ahead and bought a box of bolts and a box of nuts. I bought this box at one hardware store, and I got the box of nuts at another one. But every time I take one of each and put them together, they fit. The reason for that is tucked deep inside a big heavy book like this, which I don't blame you if you don't want to read. And that's the purpose of this video today, is to talk about the fits of threads, the different classes, what those numbers mean, and how they make sure that these things are always going to fit. But to do that, we've got to start over with something a little bit simpler. At the beginning of this video, you saw me drill this hole with this bit. But you never know, this bit can wander a little bit and open that hole, and the hole may not be perfectly straight depending on how it was made. So it's nice to have a pin gauge set. If you've never seen one of these before, this is basically a set of pins in very small increments from whatever size to the biggest. This one goes from 1/4 inch to 1/2. And if I want to know what the actual size is of this thing, I can start with one pin, come in here, and there's a little bit of wiggle left in there. So I'll grab the next size up, and I can feel, okay, maybe there's just a little less wiggle in that one. Okay, this one, I can really feel the surface of that hole in there. Yeah, that one just barely fits. And if I go to the next one up, I can just get it started. Oh, yeah, that one's not quite going to go in. But this is basically the biggest pin that I can put in this hole and still freely move it back and forth. Could I get this pin to go in there all the way through? I mean, I've got it started. That's about as far as it'll go. To get it to go the rest of the way is going to take some force. I'd have to put it in some kind of a press. Some people might take a hammer and try to ram it in there, but that would be an interference fit, something that takes some additional force to shove it through. But let's have a closer look at what's going on. So we've cut a slot down to the midpoint of that hole, and now when we put our pin in, we can actually see what that fit looks like. So here we have our slot under magnification, and let's see if we can put that biggest pin that will still fit in there. And just look how small the gap is around that pin. You can see just a tiny amount of movement, probably a few tenths of a thousandth or however many hundredths of a millimeter. There's a little bit of movement there, but it's enough. It's small enough that if I go grab the next gauge pin up, I'm not going to be able to slide it in. But let's see what this looks like with a thread.
So I've run the tap through the hole, cleaned up all the chips, and now you can see we have a tap that is a near perfect fit to the hole. Now this looks a heck of a lot like that pin that was a near perfect fit to a straight hole. It's just now the tap is in a spiral shape instead of a cylinder. Now there is a tiny, tiny gap between the tap and the threads, but it's essentially zero. It is as close to perfect as you can get and still have it freely move. So there's a boundary between the two that neither can violate. And that's what these white lines are. The problem is, this isn't manufacturable. This only works because the tap made the hole. But if we were going to produce a box of bolts and a box of nuts that were all going to fit together, it would be impossible to make them all a perfect fit. So we have to allow some variation in the bolt and the nut for manufacturability. So on the bolt, it has to be allowed to get smaller. So this blue region will be the tolerance zone for the size of the bolt. Conversely, the nut has to be allowed to get larger. So the red represents the tolerance zone of the nut. Conceptually, this is the best fit you can hope for a thread. It doesn't matter what profile, what angle, whether it's metric or inch. You can't get any tighter than a perfect fit and expect it to be able to move. But to be able to manufacture it, there has to be some variation in the size of the bolt and the size of the nut. So, of course, you're going to have a little bit of slop in there, but this is the best you can do. Under the inch standard, this is known as a class 3 fit. Under the metric standard, I believe it's an H. And you can expect that if you're classifying threads like this, occasionally you're going to be making a bolt that is up against the upper tolerance and a nut that is against the lower tolerance, and it's going to be a bit of a tight fit, and you have to evaluate whether that's going to be okay in your design.
Let's say you're concerned about your bolt starting to rust while it's sitting on the shelf. So you decide to protect it with some paint or powder coat or nickel plating or galvanizing. Now, where is that coating going to go? Anything we add to the bolt is going to make it bigger, and we already have the potential for a perfect fit. That means we can't add any coatings because there is zero allowance for it. If we want to add coatings, we have to make room. Remember that perfect boundary between the bolt and nut? That's known as the basic profile. To make room for the coating, we're going to have to shrink the bolt from basic by the allowance, which we're going to show in green. Now under ISO, this is known as the fundamental deviation, but to simplify things, I'm just going to stick with national inch thread terms for the rest of this video, because that's what I've used the most, but the concepts are the same no matter which standard you're using. As long as we're adding room for coating, let's grow those size tolerances so the nut and bolt are easier and cheaper to manufacture. In the inch standard, this is known as a class 2 fit, and it's what you're going to find on the shelf at the hardware store. But the allowance isn't just for the coatings. We can decide not to protect the bolt at all and just use the allowance to guarantee there will always be a gap. This ensures that parts will always go together without resistance in high cycle applications. But what if a farmer is working on a tractor in a field far away from his shop? He drops a bolt, it hits something hard on the way down and lands in the dirt. When he finds the bolt, the threads are dented and covered with dirt. If this was a class 3 fit, there's no way that bolt would go inside. Now, it might work on a class 2,
But to give the farmer the best chance, we can add even more allowance and more tolerance to make it cheaper still. This is known as a Class 1 fit. Now it's interesting, the allowance of a Class 1 is not to be used for coatings. It's all for damaged and dirty threads. Class 2 is the only case where the maximum thread size can be exceeded with a coating. Every other application requires that the thread be made smaller prior to coating, so the size tolerances are never exceeded.
One of the best ways to look at these fits is graphically. So starting here with the Class 3 fit, we can see that there's no gap between the bolt and the nut when they're at their tightest fit. Class 2 there is, and the tolerance of the bolt and the nut is larger. And of course in Class 1 the tolerances are the largest, as is the gap, which allows for that dirt and damage on the threads, so those still go together. Something that's readily apparent on this graph that may not have been earlier in the video is that the nut, the smallest that the nut can get, never changes no matter which class it is. They've just chosen to apply that allowance, that gap, to the bolt in every case. One of the main reasons for this, as it's spelled out in the Machinery's Handbook, is that applying some kind of a coating to the inside of a thread is really tough to do. Whereas a bolt, there it is. We can apply whether it's painted on or whatever it might be. Now in the Class 2, remember, we can use all of that allowance for coatings, or we can have no coatings at all, or you could even cut the bolt a little bit smaller and build it back up with the coating, as long as it doesn't exceed the maximum limits of size. And that's the case for all of these. Now I've seen cases where the engineer says, man, I want the best fit I can possibly get. I'm going with a Class 3 fit on this application. And that's fine, but then we're buying a Class 3 tap and making this hole, and if that tap wears out enough and you make some holes, eventually you're going to go put a fastener in, and all of a sudden, hey, this thing is hard to tighten in. So you're either going to deal with it in an assembly department, or the end customer, if they're assembling something together, is going to feel that tight fit. So just be aware of the consequences when you're classifying a fit. One last thing I wanted to cover in this video is coating thicknesses. We tend to think of coatings like nickel plating as so thin that we don't have to worry about compensating for it in our fits. But the truth is, whatever the thickness of the coating is, to find out what that does to the fit, it's times 4. The first time I heard that, I thought, no, that can't possibly be. But then I drew it out and looked at that thickness, and you draw a triangle for a 60 degree included, which is unified thread form, metric or standard. This vertical leg ends up being exactly double what this leg is. So whatever your coating thickness is, you're going to have a leg here for the diameter that is double what it is in the direction of the coating. And you say, okay, well that's 2 times. Well, guess what? There's 2 sides on every fastener, right? So 2 times here and then 2 times again on the other side for a total of 4 times. So even if you have a really, really thin coating, just remember, whatever that thickness is, it's times 4 on the diameter. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. Hopefully that was of some help to you. If you'd like to see more content like this, please like, subscribe to the channel, share it with anybody you think might be able to benefit from it. Tell me in the comments what else you might like to see. If you'd like to help out, there's a couple of ways you could do that. If you work in industry and you've got extra tooling like end mills or lathe tools or some raw materials lying around that you'd like to send me an email and I'll let you know exactly what I'm looking for. Or you could make a small donation. A handful of people have donated to the channel using my PayPal account, and that has been awesome. Thank you so much. Anything, $5, $10, whatever, helps pay for all this stuff that I'm using up and mills that I'm making dull, whatever. And of course, I always appreciate the positive comments. It means a lot to me. I'm really glad to hear that people are getting value out of this. That's it for now. See you in the next video.